Welcome to another deep dive, and this time we're going to be talking about SCN2A related disorders. Kind of digging into the research and hearing some stories about how this one gene can cause so many different conditions. And maybe you're listening because you're connected to this topic in some
Yeah.
way, or maybe you're just really fascinated by, by the brain and how it works.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people are going to be interested in this for sure. I mean, when you think about it, it's amazing how much influence just one gene can have on how our brains develop and how they function.
Okay, so, maybe we should start with the basics.
Mm.
What is SCN2A and why is it so important?
Sure. So SCN2A is a gene that provides instructions for building a certain type of sodium channel, and this is called NaV1.2. And sodium channels are absolutely crucial for the way that neurons communicate with each other.
So it's kind of like, if you think of the neurons as the brain's wiring, then these channels are like the signals running through them.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Sodium channels are like these tiny little gates on the surface of neurons, and they control the flow of sodium ions, which are like, these electrically charged particles. And it's this flow that creates the electrical signals, and that's how neurons communicate.
Okay, and NaV 1.2, the one that's built from the SCN2A gene, is that like particularly important?
It is, yeah, especially when we're talking about brain development. Imagine you're building a complex circuit board and you need all the wires to be in exactly the right place. Well, NaV 1.2 kind of makes sure that the brain circuits are wired up correctly. And especially in the neocortex, which is like the area responsible for higher level thinking, so you can see why it's so vital.
Right, yeah, that makes sense. So what happens when something goes wrong with this gene, with SCN2A?
Well, then we start to see a whole bunch of neurodevelopmental disorders, and these are generally called SCN2A related disorders. Basically, mutations or errors in this gene can disrupt how the NaV 1.2 channel works.
Now, I know our sources talked about something called gain of function and loss of function mutations. Can you explain the difference between those two?
Sure, so think about it like a volume knob on, like for neuronal activity. So a gain of function mutation is like turning that volume up way too high, the neuron becomes super active, and a loss of function is like turning that volume down, and so we get reduced activity.
Oh, so both situations can lead to problems.
Right, exactly.
So are these different mutations then linked to like specific disorders?
Yeah, there's definitely a connection. So gain of function, that's often associated with early onset epilepsy. Sometimes those seizures start in infancy or early childhood. But loss of function, you might see later onset epilepsy or sometimes even no epilepsy at all. But that's where we start to see more connections with autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability.
So it seems like, getting the diagnosis right is really crucial to getting the right support. And we had this really powerful piece from the Family SCN2A Foundation in our sources. And it seems like they're playing such a vital role in supporting these families.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they offer so many resources and they connect families and advocate for research funding. But one of the things that really stood out to me was the way they share the stories of these families who are living with SCN2A related disorders.
Yeah, I mean, you can really feel reading those stories what these families are going through.
Absolutely. And every story is unique. Some families talk about just the shock of the diagnosis, especially when their child seemed to be developing typically at first. Others talk about the challenges of managing these complex symptoms, and even just navigating the healthcare system can be really difficult.
Yeah, it sounds like a real roller coaster of emotions.
Oh, it is. From that initial diagnosis to the ongoing care to the hope for finding new treatments.
And speaking of diagnosis, our sources mentioned that it can be tricky. Especially for people who don't have epilepsy, it seems like getting that diagnosis can be a real struggle.
Right, and that delay can have huge consequences. Early intervention is so important with any neurodevelopmental disorder. The sooner they can get the right support and therapies, the better chance they have of reaching their full potential.
So it's not just about finding a cure, it's about improving the whole journey for these families. And what's so fascinating is that all of this is stemming from just one gene.
It is, and the research in this field is moving really quickly. Scientists are using these incredible tools to study how different SCN2A mutations affect the brain.
So I imagine all of this new knowledge is opening up some really exciting possibilities for treatment.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Researchers are exploring a ton of different strategies right now. We're talking about small molecule drugs that might be able to modulate the NaV 1.2 channel, and even some cutting-edge genetic medicines that target the root of the problem, the genetic cause.
Wow, genetic medicines, that sounds incredibly futuristic. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so genetic medicines are definitely on the cutting edge. And one of the most promising approaches is using something called antisense oligonucleotides, or ASOs for short.
Okay, ASOs, I remember seeing that in the research. But how do they actually work?
So they work by targeting the RNA, which you can think of as the messenger that carries instructions from DNA to the protein-building machinery in the cell.
So, like, DNA is the master blueprint and RNA is a copy of a page of that blueprint.
Exactly, a great analogy. And what ASOs do is they bind to a specific RNA molecule, and they can change how it functions.
So in the case of SCN2A, an ASO could actually target the RNA that's making the NaV1.2 channel.
That's right, and if it's a gain-of-function mutation that's causing too much activity, then the ASO can decrease production of the protein and basically turn that volume down. And the opposite's true, too. For loss of function, we can use a different ASO to increase protein production.
So it's like fine-tuning the activity to try and restore that balance. Are there any ASOs that are currently being tested for these disorders?
There are, yeah. Praxis Precision Medicines, for example, they've got a clinical trial going on right now using something called non-conjugated ASOs for SCN2A related disorders. And the early data from that trial is looking pretty promising. And there are several what we call N of 1 trials as well.
Now, you mentioned non-conjugated ASOs. What are conjugated ASOs and why is that distinction important?
That's a great question. One of the biggest hurdles when we're trying to develop therapies for brain disorders is getting the treatment past something called the blood-brain barrier. And that barrier is kind of like a gatekeeper. It protects the brain from harmful substances, but it can also block medications from getting in. But conjugated ASOs have this special chemical tag attached to them that helps them cross that barrier.
So it's not just about designing the right genetic medicine, it's about making sure it can get where it needs to go.
Absolutely, and researchers are working on all sorts of delivery strategies to try and improve the effectiveness of ASOs and other genetic medicines.
Our sources also mentioned something called gene editing as a potential therapy. Now that sounds even more futuristic than ASOs. What is that, and how could it be used for these disorders?
Gene editing, yeah, that's a revolutionary technology, and it basically lets scientists make very precise changes to the DNA sequence. So instead of just adjusting that volume, we're talking about going in and correcting the actual blueprint.
Wow, so what kind of gene editing techniques are being explored for SCN2A?
There are a few, but the two most promising are probably base editing and prime editing. And they offer this potential for personalized correction. You know, we could tailor it to the individual's specific mutation.
So it's like having a personalized repair manual for the gene.
Yeah, exactly. And the Family SCN2A Foundation is actually actively supporting projects that are looking into this. It's a long-term goal, but it holds such incredible potential for actually curing these disorders.
It's amazing to think that we might be on the verge of treatments like that. But I imagine there are challenges too, right? Especially when we're talking about something as powerful as gene editing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest ones is safety, making sure that we don't cause any unintended consequences. We have to be so careful when we're talking about making changes to the human genome.
What other challenges are researchers facing?
Well, the brain is just incredibly complex. I mean, we're still figuring out how genes and environmental factors interact to shape development and function. And that complexity makes it really difficult to predict exactly how a therapy is going to affect an individual.
So even with something like precise gene editing, there's still a lot we don't know about how that will translate into real-world outcomes.
That's right, and that's why research is so important. We need to keep studying the biology of these disorders, figure out exactly what's going wrong, and then develop therapies that can address those specific mechanisms.
Now, our sources talked about clinical trial readiness. What does that mean when we're talking about developing treatments for SCN2A-related disorders?
So basically, it means having everything in place so that we can move a promising therapy from the lab into human testing as quickly as possible. That means understanding the disorder really well, having clear goals for the trial, and a robust infrastructure to run it.
Why is that so important for these particular disorders?
Well, because these are considered rare disorders, so that means there are fewer patients who are available for clinical trials, so we have to make the most of every opportunity to test a potential therapy.
So it's like having the launch pad ready to go when you identify a promising treatment.
Exactly, and the Family SCN2A Foundation has been instrumental in doing that groundwork. They've invested a lot in natural history studies, which track how the disorders progress, and in developing standardized ways to measure symptoms and outcomes.
This all sounds really promising, but I know drug development is a long process. So realistically, how long until we might see some of these therapies become available?
It's tough to say for sure. I mean, the research is moving fast, but it takes time to make sure a therapy is safe and effective. For ASOs, we might see some treatments within the next few years, but for something like gene editing, it's probably going to be a longer road.
It's good to have a realistic perspective,
Mm.
but it sounds like there is a lot of hope on the horizon. What would you say are the most significant advancements in the field of SCN2A research in recent years?
I think the biggest leaps have been in our understanding of the role that this gene plays in brain development. We've gone from knowing relatively little about it to really understanding how it affects neuronal communication and how the brain circuits develop. And that knowledge has been so crucial for being able to develop targeted therapies.
And it sounds like the Family SCN2A Foundation has played a huge role in that progress.
They absolutely have. Their commitment to research, connecting families, and raising awareness has been crucial.
You know, it's incredible to think about how much impact just one gene can have.
It really highlights the complexity of our biology, for sure.
And it makes me wonder about the impact these discoveries about SCN2A might have on other areas of research.
Absolutely. The research on SCN2A is not only teaching us about this specific gene, but it's also giving us these valuable insights into the broader mechanisms of brain development and neurological disorders.
So the knowledge we gain from studying this one gene could actually lead to new treatments for other conditions as well.
Exactly. The ripple effect of knowledge.
I like that, the ripple effect of knowledge. I think our listeners are really getting a sense of the progress being made and the hope that's out there. But I'd love to dig a little deeper into those personal stories from the Family SCN2A Foundation. They offer such a powerful perspective on the real-life impact of these disorders.
Yeah, I agree. Those stories are incredibly powerful. One of the things that really stuck with me was this quote from a father who said, "It's not just about the seizures. It's about the constant worry, the sleepless nights, the missed milestones, and the feeling that you're always on edge." It really captures the emotional toll that these disorders can take on families.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that the impact goes way beyond the physical symptoms. Our sources talked about understanding the full spectrum of these disorders, including the cognitive, social, and sensory challenges.
And that's why those stories are so important, because they really paint a picture of what it's actually like to live with those challenges every single day. Like one mother described how her son's sensory sensitivities made even simple things, like going to the grocery store, totally overwhelming for him. Those are the everyday struggles that we don't always get from just reading the research.
It sounds like early intervention and ongoing therapy are crucial.
They are, and a lot of families talked about the positive impact of things like speech therapy, occupational therapy, and physical therapy, but they also really stress the importance of getting that early diagnosis so they can access those therapies as quickly as possible, because those early years are so critical for brain development, and early intervention can make a world of difference.
I imagine that accessing those therapies and navigating the healthcare system can be a real struggle for families.
Oh, it can be incredibly challenging. Families often face long wait lists and issues with insurance coverage, and sometimes there's just a lack of specialized services in their area. A lot of parents talked about becoming advocates for their children, spending hours doing research and coordinating care, and fighting for the support that their children need.
It's clear that these families are incredibly strong and resilient.
They are, and their voices are so important, not just for raising awareness, but for guiding research and shaping policies. Those lived experiences provide such valuable insights that can help us understand these disorders better and develop more effective treatments and support systems.
So as we're getting ready to wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listeners will walk away with?
Well, I think the biggest one is just a deeper understanding of how complex and diverse SCN2A-related disorders are. They're not all the same. They present in so many different ways, and every individual's journey is unique.
It's not just about knowing the name of a gene, but really understanding how it impacts people's lives.
Yeah, exactly. I also hope listeners have come away with a sense of hope. I mean, there are definitely challenges, but the field is making such incredible progress, and there's a real sense of collaboration between researchers, clinicians, and patient organizations.
And all of that is fueled by the dedication of the families.
Absolutely. Their dedication is truly inspiring. It's important to remember that behind every scientific breakthrough and every new therapy, there are real people whose lives are being touched by this work.
Well said.
Yeah.
And for anyone who wants to learn more or get involved in supporting research in families, where can they go?
The Family SCN2A Foundation website is a great place to start. They have tons of information, resources, and ways to get involved. And you can also connect with other families and support groups online.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And a huge thank you to our listeners for joining us for this deep dive into the world of SCN2A-related disorders. We hope you found it insightful and informative. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.